Sir, are my slides visible, sir?
Yes,
Yeah, visible.
Make a slideshow.
Good evening, everyone, sir. I welcome you all to the today's FORI webinar, sir, which is organized by Endocrine Society of Bengal. The topic for today's webinar is side effects and complications of insulin therapy, common and rare. To speak about the topic, we have two faculties from various parts of the country, sir. The chairperson for today's seminar is Dr. Mukul Roy. Sir is a consultant endocrinologist and in charge of the endocrine clinic at Tripura Medical College, Agartala. Sir is also fellow of IACM API. Sir is also fellow of Royal College of Physicians. Sir is a joint secretary of Northeastern Diabetic Center and also Central Committee member. There is a number of multiple national and international publications to his name. I would now request Mukut Sai to kindly introduce the speaker for the day. Sir, I'm sharing slide for you.
Thank you, Dr. Devashish, for such a nice introduction. In fact, at the outset, I sincerely thank Endocrine Society of Bengal for bringing such an important topic. And this is this part of discussion by myself and Dr. Ajay is almost like a second homecoming, which I was discussing for us. By just not delaying the point, I'll just introduce our speaker, Dr. Ajay Hanumantu, who is also an ex-colleague of me we are from same alumnus from the same medical college. He is a consultant endocrinologist at present and attached with the Columbia Asia Hospital, Mysore, and also with Sri Raghavendra Endocrine Super Specialty Center. We know that and the Columbia Asia has been taken up by the Manipal Group, as we are discussing. And he has got multiple publications, and he is an erudite scholar and a prolific speaker. So, Dr. Ajay, the stage is yours. Please go on to the topic.
Yes, thank you, sir. Thank you for the introduction. At the outset, I would like to thank Professor Nilanjan Sengupta sir and Endocrine Society of Bengal for providing me this opportunity to speak on this topic. I'll just share my slides now. Yeah. Are my slides visible?
Yes, sir, your slide.
Yes, perfect.
Thank you. Yeah. Without much ado, we'll be starting with the topic. The topic which I've been given to speak today is side effects and complications of insulin therapy. We'll be talking about the common as well as the rare ones. So my talk would be the agenda for this talk would be firstly a brief history of insulin therapy. Then we'll be covering skin-related complications of insulin therapy. Then allergic reactions, which include local as well as systemic. We'll be talking about insulin therapy and weight gain, insulin neuritis, insulin therapy and worsening of retinopathy, exogenous insulin antibody syndrome, and insulin therapy and cancer risk. So, as we all know, we have celebrated the centenary of insulin therapy. It's almost more than 100 years since insulin therapy started. We all know Frederick Banting and Charles Best. They first discovered insulin and was announced to the world in November 14th, 1921. Some 2 months of time was taken, and with the help of biochemist Collip, they purified the insulin, and the first insulin dose was given to 14-year-old Leonard Thompson, who was the first person to receive the injection. And this picture here you see, I'm sure all of you know, is of Leonard Thompson at his during his childhood, and also this picture here is when he was in his 20s. Now coming to the most common complication that we find in insulin therapy, which include the skin-related complications. These include lipohypertrophy, lipoatrophy, abscess, insulin edema, idiosyncratic skin reactions, insulin allergy, which could be to zinc and also protamine. Now we'll be discussing briefly about each of them. Coming to lipoatrophy, lipoatrophy is loss of subcutaneous fat at the site of injection, and it commonly occurs after 6 to 24 months of regular insulin treatment. It is more commonly seen in young people and in those who have previous dermal reactions to insulin. And it also occurs when patients do not, follow the recommended site rotation and the proper insulin techniques. But this was more common when the less purified forms of insulin were used in the earlier days. Now, since we use very well purified, highly purified insulins, the incidences come significantly down, and only less than 10% are now affected with this. Now, the pathological mechanism for this is the lipolytic components of certain insulin preparations, that is, which were used earlier, and also sometimes immune-mediated inflammatory processes also are responsible for lipoatrophy. Coming to the treatment of lipoatrophy, we are supposed to tell the patient to avoid taking injections at those sites. And the recently developed highly purified recombinant and analog insulins are preferable. And also repeated injections of highly purified porcine or human insulin into the affected area have been associated with more than 90% regression of the atrophic area and reaccumulation of fat cells. However, if all these measures fail, dexamethasone injection has been tried 4 microgram per unit to the insulin injection site. This may be effective in restoring the fat deposits. The other very common one, which we even now see in our clinical practice, is lipohypertrophy. This more commonly is reported as a cutaneous complication of insulin therapy, and those who have recently initiated insulin therapy and those who are young age with low BMI and who use abdomen as the injection site and who do not rotate the injection sites on a regular basis. These people are prone to develop lipohypertrophy. These are some pictures of lipohypertrophy, which you can see here. Now, this presents as soft dermal nodules, a consequence of the lipogenic effect of insulin. We all know that insulin is lipogenic, and repeated injections at the same site can lead to increased hypertrophy of the fat layer. So patients often, they continue to inject at these sites. That is because that is a relatively anesthetic area, so they don't feel the pain. So they keep on injecting in the same site, and this will lead on to further lipohypertrophy. Nodules have decreased vascularity, and this results in impaired insulin absorption. And we sometimes see patients taking very high doses. They might not be requiring that, and the reason for that is they keep injecting into such sites which are less vascular. Now, the treatment for this would be to teach the patient to take the insulin. The correct insulin injection technique has to be taught, and he or she has to rotate the injection sites. And changing to the short-acting, rapidly absorbed analog insulins have also reduced incidence of lipohypertrophy. Now, if avoidance of affected areas or any of the other therapeutic options fail, then removal of the affected site may be desirable. And lipohypertrophy can be treated successfully with syringe-assisted liposuction as well, which can be done under local anesthesia. Now, allergy is something which we don't commonly see, but it was very common earlier. In fact, even Leonard Thompson initially for the first dose did develop an allergic reaction at the site. Later on, with recent techniques and highly purified insulins and recombinant insulins, this incidence has significantly reduced. Now, these allergic reactions may be divided into local as well as systemic. We'll be discussing both of them. Coming to the local reactions, they tend to be erythematous, pruritic, and occasionally indurated, and they occur at the site of injection. Now, most of the times there is an isolated wheal and a flare reaction, which is commonly mediated by IgE antibodies to insulin with mast cell activation. Now, these symptoms usually resolve after an hour. Sometimes this takes about sometimes these typically occur about a week after the initiation of therapy, and this more commonly is due to IgG mediated effect. And this is biphasic, that is, there is an initial wheal and flare reaction, which is followed by a late phase peaking at around 4 to 6 hours that can last up to 24 hours. Now, induration at the injection site may last longer. Sometimes it can extend for several days. There's a delayed tuberculin-like reaction also, which has been seen, and these are mainly mediated by cell-mediated mechanisms, and they develop 8 to 12 hours post-insulin administration, and there's a peak which is seen at 24 hours, and this lasts for several days. Now, there are some systemic reactions as well, other than local reactions. These systemic allergic reactions are very rare these days because we have very purified insulins available. These were all seen in the earlier days when they were using bovine insulin and all the other earlier formulations of insulin. Now, those reactions included urticaria, generalized rash, pruritus, and even paresthesia. Angioneurotic edema and circulatory collapse have also been described in association with insulin use. However, it's not very common. Now, a treatment for this is similar to any anaphylaxis of any cause. Now, the insulin molecule itself, now what causes this allergic reaction? It has been found that sometimes the proinsulin in its unpurified insulin preparation forms, or even the recent insulins, which include zinc and protominated insulin, they also have been found to produce allergic reactions. Now, the difference in the amino acid sequence in bovine, porcine, and human insulin, they have been incited as a reason for the greater antigenicity of bovine insulin versus porcine and human insulin. Zinc and protamine contained in the neutral regular insulin and the NPH insulin have also been associated with cutaneous allergic reactions. Now, managing these local allergic skin reactions include, they're usually short-lived and they resolve spontaneously. Sometimes we might have to use an antihistaminic, which reduces the symptoms, and it can block the wheal and flare response. Now, if the skin reaction persists for longer than 2 to 4 weeks, then we can try to change the formulation of insulin to a better one, an analog insulin or a recombinant insulin. That should help. If changing insulin does not resolve the allergic reaction, there are a number of potential options that include dividing the dose and varying the delivery site, addition of dexamethasone to insulin, oral antihistamines or corticosteroids, continuous insulin infusion or pump therapy, and insulin desensitization may also be tried. Now, the other complication which we might come across are skin abscesses. Skin abscesses, they occur due to insulin injection per se, and they are very rare these days because of the purified preparations. However, skin abscess or cellulitis because of continuous therapy, that is an insulin infusion, is one of the most common causes listed for discontinuation of insulin pump therapy. There are some idiosyncratic skin reactions as well. The most common one being simple bruising, which most often causes cosmetic problems. Pigmentation, hyperpigmentation can occur at insulin injection sites. This might lead to plaque formation resembling acanthosis nigricans, and rarely keloids can develop. This again is when patients keep injecting at the same site and they do not rotate the site. Now, this is another form of idiosyncratic skin reaction that is found, which is localized amyloidosis. This sometimes is mistaken for lipohypertrophy, but they both are different conditions. Now, insulin per se has been associated as one of the many proteins that are found in amyloid congregations or amyloid fibrils. These amyloid lesions, they are more firm and they are solid than those of lipohypertrophy. That is one way by which we can, on examination, distinguish them. And these amyloid congregations or amyloid localized aggregates, they are unlikely to regress after injection site rotation. As with lipohypertrophy, insulin absorption may be influenced and treatment by excision may be appropriate in such cases. Now, the diagnosis at excision or biopsy is by the usual histological methods and staining to identify the amyloid fibrils. Now coming to the next complication of insulin therapy, which is a very common one, that is insulin and weight gain. Now, there are different mechanisms that have been put forth, and these include conservation of calories or conservation of ingested calories as improved glycemic control returns patients to glycemic levels that are below the renal threshold. That is, they start utilizing the glucose better. And insulin itself, it has a anabolic effect, so it inhibits lipolysis and it promotes the lipogenesis and also protein metabolism. Now, all these lead to increased weight gain. Now, the other thing that can happen is with the insulin therapy, we all know a very common side effect is hypoglycemia. And as a compensatory mechanism of hypoglycemia, these patients try to take in more of carbohydrates and food in response to such hypoglycemic spells, which again can lead to weight gain. Now, there's another mechanism or a central effect that happens on the appetite and weight regulation. The intact insulin and leptin signaling, they are believed to be required to produce an anorectic response. Any single defect involving these signals could lead to central insulin resistance. Now, this would result in the anabolic actions of circulating insulin no longer being opposed by the catabolic and anorectic neuronal responses that insulin would normally stimulate via the hypothalamus. Now, this would lead to increased weight gain by reduced suppression of appetite. This is one interesting mechanism. The other one is unphysiological insulin replacement, when there is an imbalance between insulin supply and the physiological need, with periods of both over and under supply during each day. This can also lead to increased weight gain. Now, the most commonly or the only route which we use as of now is the subcutaneous route. And one of the drawbacks of this route is that it does not mimic the normal physiological insulin production. What happens in normal insulin secretion, we all know that insulin enters into the portal circulation and it is first to reach the liver, and liver is the first organ that has the effects of insulin. But when we give it in a subcutaneous route, it is the peripheral system or the periphery of the body which receives insulin first, and this again can lead to increased weight gain. Now, the absorbed insulin first circulates systemically, so it has a disproportional influence on muscle and adipose tissue. So it first reaches the muscle and adipose tissue, which normally doesn't happen in physiological insulin release. The liver here is under insulinized and the periphery is over insulinized. So perhaps an unphysiological distribution. This partly explains the disproportionate increase in fat mass, which is typically reported with insulin therapy. Now, how do we limit insulin associated weight gain? One very important thing or aspect of diabetes is definitely lifestyle and exercise and dieting. This definitely will help in reducing the high insulin requirement and weight gain. Now, we can use other pharmacological interventions, which include metformin, GLP-1 therapy, and SGLT2 inhibitors to combat the weight gain. Now, there's one enigma of insulin detemir with regard to weight gain. Now, the mechanism has not yet been defined, but it has been found that detemir does not have that sort of a increased effect on the weight. Now, there are a few hypotheses which have been given for this, and these include that detemir is associated with a reduced risk of nocturnal hypoglycemia. So that hypoglycemia leading on to weight gain, that part of it might be reduced due to it. And insulin detemir is 98% albumin bound in the circulation, and its access to the peripheral compartment is physically limited, whereas it retains full access to hepatocytes via hepatic sinusoids. This is another mechanism by which it might not be resulting in weight gain. A third speculative theory is that the lipophilic fatty acid side chain, which is found in insulin detemir, or the relatively low albumin content of CSF that permits a relatively increased access to the CNS receptors. Now that mechanism which we were talking about earlier, the central resistance, that also is taken care of here. Now the other complication which is seen with insulin is insulin neuritis. This is usually happens when there's a rapid control of blood sugars. That is, there is a decline in the HbA1c of more than 1% per month. When there's a rapid reduction in the HbA1c or a rapid correction of the glycemic status, there is something known as insulin neuritis that happens. Now the term as such, insulin neuritis, is not very commonly used now, and it is now termed as treatment-induced neuropathy of diabetes. That is a more appropriate terminology, which is now in practice. And this usually happens in those who have rapid reestablishment of a previously poor glycemic control. And this presents with neuropathic pain, and sometimes symptoms of autonomic dysfunction, and a combination of both may be seen. And now, as I told, the recently proposed terminology for this is treatment-induced neuropathy of diabetes, which is more accurate name for this entity. Now, the proposed mechanisms for insulin neuritis, they include two important mechanisms have been put forth. One is the vascular steal, or this happens due to proliferation of epineural vessels with evidence of arteriovenous shunting, and this results in a vascular steal phenomenon, and this leads to ischemia of the endoneurium. And since the endoneurium is ischemic, there is development of neuropathic pain. This is one of the mechanisms. The other mechanism which has been put forth is nerve regeneration. Now, the normoglycemic state, it promotes the regeneration of damaged neurons, and this results in ectopic signal generation, which leads on to neuropathic pain. Now, coming to the treatment of insulin neuritis, it can be managed by similar in the lines of neuropathic pain, which we usually treat in diabetic patients. The first line medication here is amitriptyline, or SSRI, or a selective serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor, or duloxetine. Second line medications include gabapentin, pregabalin, carbamazepine, and topiramate. And lastly, opioids. Most patients usually recover with 6 months of onset of insulin neuritis. Now, the other thing that is seen with insulin therapy is worsening of retinopathy. Now, similar to insulin neuritis or treatment-induced neuropathy of diabetes, this is similar, and it happens in those who have been recently initiated with insulin therapy and those who have had a very bad control prior to the initiation. And tight glycemic control with insulin is associated with early risk of worsening of diabetic retinopathy. This had been reported in the DCCT trial, where it occurred in 13.1% of the intensive therapy group versus 7.6% of those who were on the conventional treatment group. Now, the proposed mechanisms here are, there are three mechanisms which have been put forth. One is high dose of exogenous insulin. It could act synergistically with the vascular endothelial growth factor, which is expressed by the ischemic retina, so as to trigger a vascular proliferation and worsening of the diabetic retinopathy. Now, when there is a rapid correction of the blood glucose levels, there is a vasodilatory effect of the hyperglycemic state, and when there is a rapid correction of the glucose status or the glycemic status, there's vasoconstriction that happens, and that might lead to retinal hypoxia. The other mechanism is increased angiogenesis, and that is again due to elevated IGF-1 consequent to the hyperinsulinemia. Now, coming to the other rare complication of insulin therapy, which we don't come across very commonly, is exogenous insulin antibody syndrome. Now, with the use of highly purified recombinant insulins, these antibody syndromes are not very common. So I'll just briefly talk about those which we have come across. So insulin antibodies, they may be induced by exogenous insulin in diabetic patients and is usually associated with hypersensitivity reactions. And such antibodies, once they develop, can lead to difficulty in achieving a good glycemic control, leading on to glycemic variability. And this again affects the metabolic control. And these antibodies can also lead to insulin resistance. And these antibodies can lead to hyperglycemia as well as hypoglycemia. I will explain how hyperglycemia and hypoglycemia both can occur. Now, factors which affect the insulin antibody development are the formulation of insulin itself. Now that we don't use animal insulins, the immunogenicity of animal insulins, which is higher, which is not very commonly found now. Earlier, when they were using those insulins, these antibody formations and antibody reactions were more during those earlier periods. Although the amino acid sequence of recombinant human insulin is consistent with that of human insulin, it can induce insulin autoantibodies, with exogenous insulin being more immunogenic. There was a recent study by Hattori and co-workers who have in their study found that glargine and aspart in their study were found to be more antigenic when compared to other insulin analogs. Now, factors affecting insulin antibody development could also be the delivery route of insulin. This is there are few articles which I found which suggested that the use of inhaled insulins were found to result in a higher insulin antibody formation when compared to subcutaneous administration. Now, there are other factors also which can lead to increased formation of insulin antibodies, which could be genetic predisposition, that is presence of certain HLA phenotype or HLA antigens in the patient, which increase the risk of formation of such antibodies. Age is also one of the factors which has been put forth as one of the factors leading to increased insulin antibody formation. And the development of insulin antibodies in response to exogenous insulin, it may be inversely correlated with age. Now, I just told that there are chances of developing hypoglycemia as well as hyperglycemia. Now, how does that happen? This is one of the mechanisms that they have put forth to explain this. Now, what happens when there's increased insulin antibodies is that they bind to the insulin. And as you can see in the picture here, these insulin molecules which are bound by the antibody will not act on the insulin receptor, and that will lead on to hyperglycemia. And this usually they have found in during the daytime. And during the night, what happens is, what they have found is that there is dissociation of these insulin molecules, and this dissociation leads to increased insulin availability, and that might lead on to hypoglycemia. This is one of the mechanisms which have been put forth. Now, coming to the treatment of exogenous insulin antibody syndrome, it includes discontinuation of the insulin for the short period of time, and combination of oral hypoglycemic agents. Now, the explanation for this I'll be giving in the next few slides. They found that combining metformin with alpha glucosidase inhibitor and combination of liraglutide and sulfonylurea, this has been found to reduce the insulin antibody syndrome. The mechanism for that I'll be explaining here. The potential explanation for these observations, they are as follows. Sulfonylurea, since it stimulates the production of pre-insulin, it reduces the binding capacity of insulin antibodies and insulin, and thereby it might help in preventing the insulin antibody syndrome. Metformin may strengthen the action of free insulin and promote the dissociation of insulin immune complexes and help in the reduction of this insulin antibody syndrome. GLP-1 receptor agonists, they act as potent stimulators of insulin secretion, especially in combination with sulfonylurea, and we can enhance the role of insulin when given in combination. The other treatment strategies to combat exogenous insulin antibody syndrome include use of glucocorticoids, immunosuppressants, plasmapheresis has also been tried. Medical nutrition therapy has also been found to help in this condition. Now, a very common complication of insulin therapy, which includes, which we all know is hypoglycemia. So hypoglycemia, it can happen due to when the patient is given too much of insulin, or he takes little food, or in conditions of extreme exercise. So the other thing which we all know is the Somogyi effect. Now this is hyperglycemia which occurs secondary to asymptomatic hypoglycemia, which usually occurs at night. And this usually happens when the nighttime dose of insulin or the long-acting insulin is given at a higher dose. Now to be careful with this, we can advise the patient to have a check of the CBG at 3 a.m. To find out if he is having hypoglycemia. And this is more commonly seen with the NPH insulin and not that common with the other long-acting insulins like Glargine or Degludec. Now, insulin therapy and hypoglycemia, the management we all know is a reasonable dose of 20 grams of glucose. And since it's an ongoing state of hyperinsulinemia, we need to be careful for the subsequent hours as well. So glycemic response to oral glucose is just transient. So we have to keep a watch on the glycemic status after 2 hours as well. So ingestion of a snack or a meal shortly after the glucose level is raised is usually advisable. The other thing is to give or advise the patient to take carbohydrate orally. And in case glucagon injection is available, 1 mg dose of subcutaneously injected or intramuscularly injected glucagon is helpful. In conditions where the patient develops hypoglycemia and is not able to take in orally, in such conditions, intravenous dextrose may be used. Now, the glycemic response again here to IV glucose is transient in the setting of ongoing hyperinsulinemia. So, IV glucose administration often needs to be followed by a glucose infusion. And once it is practical, we need to advise the patient to take some carbohydrates. Now, coming to a very controversial and very, rare, we can say, complication of insulin therapy is insulin therapy and cancer risk. Now, type 2 diabetes mellitus, as we all know, is a chronic condition, and since it's a chronic condition and with the availability of very good treatment, patients are surviving for a longer time. So the risk of developing cancers, which include those of pancreas, breast, and colon, also occur because of aging as well. So it's very difficult to pinpoint the cause for this and pinpoint it to the use of insulin. So the association may be multifactorial and it may be linked to obesity, insulin resistance, or hyperglycemia. And it's difficult to point it or to say insulin per se is causing the cancer. That's one difficulty in these studies which are conducted. Now, insulin analogs and development of cancer is one interesting thing. So here, the binding affinity of these analog insulins, especially that of Glargine, is high and to that of IGF-1 receptor. And this was one of the mechanisms which was put forth, and Glargine, initially there was some controversy regarding Glargine and development of cancer, which has been now proved to be wrong. And I'll be explaining the study which was conducted and also how it has been proved to be wrong. Now, some in vitro studies have shown that insulin glargine, detemir, and lispro, they have a proliferative and anti-apoptotic activity in cultured cancer cells. Now we need to note here that all those studies initially which showed that there's increased chance of cancer were in vitro studies, and at that point of time the mechanism of action of glargine was not very clear, or I should say not the mechanism of action, it is the pharmacokinetics. Pharmacokinetics of glargine was not very clear when these initial reports of cancer came into being. Now, those studies which were conducted, they were not done on humans. It was they were in vitro studies which were done on cancer cells. And what happened there was glargine was given, and glargine acted on the IGF-1 receptors of those cells and led on to increased proliferative effect. But later on, when the pharmacokinetics of glargine, became more clear, it was found that when glargine is injected subcutaneously, there are certain proteases which act at the local as well as systemic level, which break down the glargine into two metabolites, which have been named as M1 and M2. Now, these M1 constitutes about 70% of the breakdown product, and M2 is the 30% of it. And this M1 and M2 are the ones which are going to act on the insulin receptor as well as the IGF-1 receptor. And the action of this M1 and M2 is significantly lesser on the IGF-1. This is how glargine, we can say, is those studies which were done earlier were not accurate. And since M1 and M2 are the byproducts of glargine and they do not act in a similar fashion as glargine on the IGF-1 receptors, the risk of cancer is absolutely nil. And this was what was proved by the Origin trial. Now, insulin glargine itself has a 6 to 8-fold increase in IGF-1 receptor affinity. And the first analog, this is interesting, that was developed, that is insulin B10 asp, which was actually withdrawn during development due to dose-dependent increase in mammary adenocarcinomas in the rats. This was the first insulin analog, and it was withdrawn because it increased the mammary carcinoma in rats. Now, this molecule, it had a 6-fold increase in affinity for the IGF-1 receptor, and it also had a slow dissociation from the insulin receptor, which theoretically may have caused the increased mitogenicity. Now, as I was saying, insulin glargine and development of cancer, there's a sequential cleavage that happens of the carboxyl terminus of the C chain, which occurs via local as well as systemic, which occurs via local and systemic converting proteases. And this leads on to the primary metabolite M1 and the secondary metabolite M2. Now, this biotransformation in serum, it occurs rapidly, and 70% of the insulin glargine is converted into M1 within 30 minutes of incubation. So majority of it is converted to M1. So glargine per se is not acting, it's M1 that will act. And the metabolites M1 and M2, they retain the full biologic activity of human insulin, and they also have substantially reduced IGF-1 receptor binding and mitogenic potency relative to the human insulin. Whereas insulin glargine per se has a greater affinity for IGF-1 receptor than human insulin. It is about 100-fold lower than the native IGF-1 affinity. The primary M1 and the secondary M2 metabolites, they are less metabolically active and they have reduced affinity to IGF-1 receptors. So the earlier hypothesis of glargine causing cancer, which was done on in vitro studies on cancer cell lines, did not take into consideration this aspect of it because the pharmacokinetics at that point of time were not known. So that gave a false alarm of cancer. And the virtual absence of the parent compound insulin glargine in the circulation after its subcutaneous injection invalidates the submission that the in vitro findings of enhanced IGF-1 binding and mitogenicity of insulin glargine as a clinical correlate. Now, again, insulin glargine, it is extensively metabolized to M1 and M2. This I've already told. Now, This was again proved by the origin trial at that there was no association between insulin glargine and increased risk of any cancer. Neither analysis of all cancers combined nor analysis of any organ specific type of cancer suggested an increased risk for the users of insulin glargine. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Raja, for
Sir, for the
insightful, even elaborative presentation. The House remains open for discussion. So before going to the question and answer session, I can see two of my respected teachers in the learned audience also. So I request first from Niranjan sir to comment on this presentation.
Yeah, first, Ajay,
Yes, sir.
please unshare your slides.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, and that was a very masterly presentation by Dr. Ajay Hanumantu. Thank you very much.
Thank
You have taken rather a difficult, means if you just deal with hypoglycemia and weight gain as the complications of insulin therapy, that ends it in say 10-15 minutes. But if you take into the rare enigmatic complications, I will take, rather these are comments from my side rather than questions. The Detimir one means when
Yes,
Detimir came, actually, when you started as BM endocrinology students, Detimir was on the down slope of its popularity, but we saw it to be launched, and then the manufacturers, meaning Novo Nordisk, used to say that since they caused less of nocturnal hypoglycemia and the overall hypoglycemia, the defensive snacking is less, and so the chances of weight gain is less. But I didn't buy this explanation simply because the further basal insulins like degludec and U300 glargine, they claim to be even safer so far as nocturnal hypoglycemia is concerned. There may be a debate, claims and counterclaims on which one is the safest so far as nocturnal and overall hypoglycemia is concerned. But I think they are, at least on paper, less causing hypoglycemia than Detimir. So there should also be a lesser weight gain. So that didn't happen with glargine, U300 or degludec. And just as Detimir is protein bound, glargine, or I mean degludec is also protein bound. So I think we really do not know the answer. I think that was a play of chance, or maybe the finding which could not be explained. Second thing which you have also pointed out, the Somogyi effect and the Dawn phenomenon. Somogyi effect, that is post-hypoglycemic hyperglycemia, very pet question in the exams. But even Somogyi had at one point of time commented that probably it doesn't exist. It was because of the pharmacologic inadequacy of the basal insulin, which you have pointed out that it happened with NPH and others, lenti insulins of the past. We do not see Somogyi effect. Did you see Somogyi effect in your residency years, or Mukund, do you see now in your practice?
No, sir. Not that.
We do not see. So I think Somogyi effect is probably, was rather the result of a pharmacologic inadequacy of NPH. Now that we are using better basal insulins, we are not getting with that problem. And I think very few of our patients, we have to make the patient wake up and take a 3 a.m. blood sugar to decide that. Having said that, Ajay, you haven't commented anything on Mauriac syndrome. Do you think, still, because we had recently a publication again from one of our alumnus, Shaptik, actually published a case report of where I'm also a co-author, the Mauriac syndrome. So somehow Mauriac syndrome has been related to over-insulinization. Again, we see really whether we see Mauriac syndrome that much these days is debated. We definitely do not see that much of Moriarty syndrome these days. Maybe we miss the diagnosis sometimes, but well, there are a few anecdotal case reports like the ones which we encountered, and we confirmed that with liver biopsy too in our institution. So what are your take on Moriarty syndrome?
Sir, I actually went through a few articles, sir. Most of the times, Moriarty syndrome is found to happen in those who are not treated properly with insulin. That is the most common cause. But this, as you said, sir, is a very rare thing that we'll have to.
Again, a very enigmatic thing. Some say that because of inadequate suboptimal treatment, you are having that glycogen-laden
Yes, sir.
hepatopathy.
Yes,
And
sir.
there was also one hypothesis that because of over-insulinization, because
Oh,
the glucose is being stored as
Stored.
glycogen because of the anabolic effect. But again,
Mhm.
these were basically the theoretical consider hypothesis. The hypotheses were rather theoretical, and they
Yes, sir.
in those studies they said that optimizing insulin therapy, decreasing the de-intensifying insulin therapy maybe had some benefit. The point is that for glycogen-laden hepatopathy, whether it's fat or glycogen, can be decided only with liver biopsy. That being an invasive test, we generally don't do it. So because there may be some sort of overlap with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease also. I think here Obhirup is there. Would you like to comment any overlap between, because Obhirup is working on non-alcoholic fatty liver disease in type 1 diabetes. So would you like to comment whether there may be any overlap between glycogen-laden hepatopathy and fat-laden hepatopathy? If NAFLD, you can call that as fat-laden hepatopathy. Obhirup, do you have anything to suggest?
Sir, with the advancement and intensifying of the insulin therapy, the incidences of Moriarty syndrome is now very rare. It's very rare nowadays. And initially, it was proposed that it is because of due to irregular insulin therapy on patient is on and off insulin therapy, or might be due to type 1 DM related direct complication because of liver excessive accumulation of the glycogen. Because of activation one of the pathways, I cannot remember, because of one of the pathways activated in the liver parenchyma, that might cause the glycogen storage inside the liver. But now also any other things like corticosteroid administration, that might also cause glycogen hepatopathy. And the advancement of the liver imaging, now we may not have to do liver biopsy in all the cases. We can go for liver CT scan of the liver, and in liver fat, that will appear as hypodense, that will appear as a hypodense shadow, and glycogen hepatopathy, that will appear as hyperdense. That can be differentiated by CT scan.
Yeah, that is one, at least to me, that's I don't know to Mukut or Ajay, that is a theoretical, which I have read also in literature, is a theoretical differentiating point, that is doing a CT scan or maybe even an MRI to have different signals for fat and glycogen. But practically, if you give it to the sonologist, how confidently they will be able to differentiate it with those modalities. Of course, ultrasound would not be a good modality for that. I don't know. Means this is an area where we really can work upon. But yes, this is a theoretical thing that I also came across in the literature, to differentiate between fatty liver and other causes of infiltration in the liver, where CT scan or probably MRI can help over ultrasound. But I don't know how practically, means whether the sonologists here or whether the radiologists here have developed the acumen to really differentiate between the two and how much overlap is there. But then that's a very interesting area. So students, I see Professor Pradeep Roy Choudhury out here. Do you have any other comments or any other questions to Dr. Ajay or
Pradip sir,
anybody
please-
else?
Pradip sir, please unmute yourself. Sir is there.
Sir is there, but whether they have any questions or anybody else,
Sir is unmuted.
any student? Right, I think if there are no other,
Niranjan sir,
yeah,
Niranjan sir, just I wanted to hear from you your comments on. So there is some gray area, or sir, there are either a positive or negative side questions like insulin and increased risk of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease or some events. So do you think this is a theoretical concern or a practical concern?
yeah, this is a very pertinent question. Insulin, hyperinsulinemia, and atherogenesis. Since Professor Mukut Roy has addressed this question to me, I will be giving my opinion, and then I will also seek the opinion of today's speaker, Ajay, to give his opinion. I think there have been some undue concerns about exogenous insulin causing increased atherosclerosis. And then there may be some physicians and some patients may refuse insulin therapy, that exogenous insulin can aggravate atherogenesis. But I think uncontrolled hyperglycemia will also cause atherogenesis. And rather than exogenously administered insulin causing atherogenesis, hyperglycemia is the greater culprit. So on practical grounds, if insulin is needed, whether endogenous or exogenous, I mean by sulfonylureas, by GLP-1 agonists, or by DPP-4 inhibitors, you have to increase the insulin exogenously or endogenously for glycemic control. There should be no hesitation. Yes, there has been theoretical arguments that hyperinsulinemia in a state of insulin resistance, where there is resistance to the glucometabolic action of insulin, but not to the MAP kinase pathway, there may be an increased mitogenic pathway being activated, and that can lead to atherogenesis. I think that is basically an endogenous hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance. And as Ajay has pointed out, if that insulin therapy can be managed with certain strategies that also take care of insulin resistance, like weight control, exercise, maybe use of a thiazolidine, though we do not love to use insulin and pioglitazone together at this present moment, but maybe an use of SGLT2 inhibitors. So other strategies, metformin, that can actually, address insulin resistance may also be of help. Ajay, what's your take on that? Insulin causing increased atherogenesis.
Yes, sir. Sir, I completely agree with what you said, sir, because type 2 diabetes itself is a strong risk factor for developing atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. And that mainly is because of uncontrolled blood glucose levels. So if by using insulin, we can reduce the hyperglycemia and its complications, then that I think is, much better mode of therapy than not giving insulin, considering the fact that it can lead to, if at all it leads to any atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease.
Right, Dr. Professor Pradeep Chaudhary, would you want to say something?
I agree to what you have said.
Yeah.
And it's a good recap for us. Good recap for us.
Yeah, thank you. Vince, I took this opportunity to talk to Pradeep because I find to be one of the most punctual attendees, more punctual than probably our students also in this 4 webinars, and really encourage us by your presence. So I think now I hand over to, thanks Ajay once again for the excellent talk, and thanks Mukut for excellent conduction of the deliberations, I hand over to Dr. Deep Bhati for concluding this today's session and making the announcement for the next program. Over to Deep.
Thank you, Ajay sir, for the excellent talk. And I would like to thank Dr. Mukut sir for pursuing the event today. And just an announcement for the next FORI webinar. The next FORI webinar is planned for on 3rd of December 2021 between 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. The topic for the next FORI webinar is diet, micronutrients, and thyroid health. And the speaker for the topic is Dr. Amritava Ghosh, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Endocrinology at AIIMS Raipur. So hoping for all of you to join for the same.
Thank you. Good
Thank you,
night.
sir.
Stay safe.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Good night.
Good night, sir.
Good night.
Good night, sir.